We are here to discuss the urgent question, what is a conservative? And we have two of America's leading conservatives, Bret Stephens of the New York Times and Chris Buskirk from American Greatness. When Chris and Bret realized they were on this panel together, they suddenly stopped and said, hey, one of us is pro-Trump and the other is anti-Trump. We think we need a moderator. So the Aspen Institute found me. I'm Jeff Rosen. I'm the head of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Well, as those of you who applauded know, the Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to bring together liberals and conservatives to debate and educate themselves about the U.S. Constitution. It is a meaningful mission, and we are well served by having two great conservative thinkers who disagree about our current president, but may agree about some fundamental principles. So we are going to begin with the obvious question, and it is this, and we'll start with Bret. What was a conservative on January 1st, 2016, and what is a conservative today?
Well, first of all, what a pleasure and privilege to be here, and I thank all of you for skipping what I'm sure is a monumentally exciting debate that is surely going to decide the presidency come next November. Look, let me tell you what a conservative was when I came of age and became a conservative in the 1980s. Conservatives believed in a small government that tried to live within its means, or a smaller government that tried to live within its means. Conservatives believed in international engagement with allies and partners around the world in the service of not only a supreme struggle against a totalitarian or authoritarian adversary, but also for the advancement of what we used to call the free world. Conservatives believed that moral character was an integral part of political and particularly presidential leadership, and that the question of the president's moral character could never be subtracted from the larger question of the success of his presidency. Conservatives believed that by and large, the United States was enriched by immigration, and immigration not just from Norwegians with doctoral dissertations, but at every level of society, because at least in my case, my ancestors certainly came from S-hole countries. And that was another conservative, widely held conservative view. And those were views that, I mean, there were significant tactical differences between, supporters of détente and more hawkish people on the right. There were important differences between kind of Nelson Rockefeller type Republicans who kind of were more accepting of the welfare state consensus post-FDR than the Goldwater Reagan stripe, and those were significant differences in their time. But that defined a broad consensus of a conservative movement that nonetheless lived within the broader philosophical sphere of what you might call liberalism. And by liberalism, I don't mean Kamala Harris liberalism. I mean liberalism as in the principles of 1776, the principles of Adam Smith, and the Declaration of Independence. That is to say that on a whole set of core questions about what politics should be for, they understood that conservatism should be about maximizing individual liberty within the restraints and constraints of law, tradition, and so on. And I think that's what mainstream conservatism was broadly about up until January 1st, 2016. Along comes Donald Trump, and I know Chris is going to take a different view. And something changed, because conservatism suddenly, in my view, transmogrified into a more European vision of the conservative society, which is to say nativist. It believed in the concept of the nation. It was highly conscious of an us as opposed to them set of distinctions. It was not actually against big government. In some ways, it was entirely in favor of ever larger government. It had made its peace with the idea of the welfare state. But it was also opposed to not just internationalism when it came to defense policy or foreign policy, but internationalism when it came to trade. It believed that the United States, at the center of a free trading world, wasn't being enriched, it was being screwed. And finally, it was completely indifferent to the idea that the moral character of your leader has any bearing on the quality of governance. And I think those are some of the core differences, so that I now look at a Republican Party that I had voted for in every election until 2016, and I can barely recognize, well, I can recognize, but I don't at a fundamental level recognize a commonality of principles, because I don't believe Trump's Republican Party really subscribes to my sense of a good vision of responsible classical liberalism.
Thank you very much for that. Chris, you've heard Bret's opening statement that conservatism has transmogrified from Jeffersonian classical liberalism to, post the election of Donald Trump, European nativism. Your thoughts, what do you think a conservative was on January 1st, 2016, and what is a conservative today?
So I think, and I've thought about this a lot over the past few years, as you can imagine, but I think what Bret was describing was more a set of policies that were a prudential instantiation of ideas. And so I almost back up, and I don't think of conservatism as primarily a political philosophy. It's a view of human life and of human nature that then has implications for a political philosophy, which then, as a second derivative, will give rise to particular policies that may be good or bad at any given point in time. We'll take immigration as an example, since it's always a flashpoint. Immigration is something that is a prudential issue. Sometimes you, as a nation, may decide it's good for us to have a lot of immigration right now, but there's such a thing as too much, and maybe we need to slow down. And we've had a lot over the past 30 years. Time to slow down, digest, and then move on. It's not a principled issue, which I think is a place where I disagree with Bret. It's that I don't see a nativist strand in American conservatism. Could you pick out a person? Probably. But in terms of the 63.5 million people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, who identify either as Republicans or as conservatives, broadly speaking, it just isn't there. It's not as though it were there on January 1st of 16, but it wasn't on December 31st of 2015. So I come back to this thing of, well, what is conservatism's view of human nature and of human life? And conservatives tend to be temperamentally conservative in some ways. That's true, but it comes out of a view of human nature that says we have limitations, and we should be very cautious in what we try and accomplish, because particularly at scale, when government's doing something, if it goes wrong, it can go fantastically wrong, and the unintended consequences can really harm people. And so how does that then play out into a political philosophy? This is where Bret and I start to converge a little bit more, I think, which is we believe in constitutional government. In other words, we have a set of basic governing law that is the foundation of our positive law. And it's something that's knowable and understandable and accessible to all citizens. We believe in self-government. Again, this goes back to the Jeffersonian ideal, but I don't think it was specific only to him. And so let me just sort of jump forward to 2016, which I know was your question. What changed? I don't think a lot changed, to be honest with you. And I've had this discussion so many times over the past few years, and I've changed my view a little bit. There's the intellectuals debating points. You know, we had the sort of the classical sort of three legs of the Republican stool: paleoconservatives, neoconservatives, libertarians. I don't think most voters think about it that way. I think they think about, well, what's in it for me? How is this going to affect my family? How is it going to affect my kids? And so with the beginning of 2016, what a lot of people thought is there's economic distress in the middle class. The middle class has been shrinking. Household incomes have been more or less flat for almost 50 years. They've increased a little bit, but not materially. And how do we improve that? Meanwhile, to the foreign policy question, we become extremely concerned about getting involved in military conflicts that costs us trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives abroad, and yet that same concern doesn't seem to be focused inward on American citizens. Then there's what has been termed the bad orange man. So how does he fit into this? Which is the big question, because he seems like the unlikeliest of vessels, which I agree. We were talking earlier, Bret asked me, so, when he came down the escalator, what did you think? And I didn't take the candidacy seriously until I had a discussion with one of my brothers-in-law about this at a family dinner right after the first Republican debate. And context is important here. He is first-generation Chinese immigrant, a doctor, very unpolitical, though temperamentally conservative. He's a Republican, but not. He'd rather watch baseball when he gets home from the hospital rather than watching, Fox. That sort of person. And he's just a person of very high character. So when I said, "Well, what do you think of the first debate?" He said, "I really like Donald Trump," and I was absolutely convinced he was pulling my leg. And I thought to myself, well, now why? And he says, well, I just like the way he talks about the country. And I think sometimes that's what gets mistaken for nativism, is just what I think people who support Trump, myself included, would characterize as a more self-confident patriotism. Unfortunately, the vessel for that self-confident patriotism is flawed. And we recognize that, but we go to war with the army we have, not the one that we want.
Excellent. Well, the debate is well and truly set up. We have had two inspiring statements of philosophical principles which don't diverge all that much. I heard both of you endorse a kind of Jeffersonian classical liberalism, although Chris was more focused on a conservative sensibility than natural law principles, but you disagree about whether Trump fits them. So now is the time for the debate, and the question for the debate is, why do you like Trump and why don't you like Trump? But rather than just having a policy debate about describing the many things that you do and don't like about him, Bret, I'll begin by asking you, why do you believe that Trump is betraying the classical liberal or conservative principles that you outlined so eloquently?
Well, in Trump's defense, I'm not quite sure he's betraying them because I don't think he knows them in the first place. This is a guy who came into office promising senators that he was going to defend all 14 articles of the Constitution of the United States. People laugh about this. He's the president sworn to defend a Constitution that he clearly has never read, and treats with disdain, since if you're a genuine conservative and believe in a kind of originalism, and you believe that the words of the text, matter, then you're going to believe in something like birthright citizenship. And it was an effort by the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party to get rid of something as fundamental to the Constitution of, that small c, Constitution of modern American liberty, as your 14th Amendment protections to birthright citizenship. So let me just back up a second. I just want to make a point that's fundamental about conservatism, which I think is by definition, conservatism is the politics of order and caution and tradition and prudence. That's the temperament. But American conservatism is unique because the order that American conservatives are trying to protect is fundamentally a liberal order. The centerpiece of the American mission in the world, right, is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the conservative philosophy is the belief that the best way in which you protect those things is by encouraging the habits of mind and the institutions both of governance and also of civil society that are likely to engender or create citizens who can responsibly and energetically pursue life, liberty, and their own happiness. That's why American conservatism is kind of a unique creation. It is a belief that what you're really trying to preserve is this idea of liberalism. I don't really see that anywhere in Trumpian politics. I mean, there is, number one, an utter disdain for tradition, an utter disdain for habits of mind that are, that you sort of recognize as conservative, a kind of habits of lawlessness or sort of pushing the envelope of what is legally permissible, assertions and arrogations of executive power that are wholly outside of the design of the Constitution, which calls for a separation of powers, and shamefully, I think, Republican senators went along in giving the president power to, with respect to budgetary authority, and also just a broader belief of a United States that sort of stands alone, in some sense isolated from the rest of the free world, that doesn't see itself as committed to a set of, not just committed, but leading a set of principles that should matter to us not just as Americans, but like in a broader sense. One of the things that was inspiring about Reagan's leadership, I was a little boy, but I remember reading his speech in Westminster in the British Parliament, where he talked about, I'll never forget, he said, the Polish people are magnificently unreconciled to their oppression. I mean, that, to me, was the mark of a real conservative, because he understood that in some deep sense, American liberty and the fate of liberty was as much connected to what was happening in the Solidarity movement in Warsaw and Gdansk as it was to what was happening to the American worker in Detroit or Flint. And here again, I just don't see where Trump honors or respects any of these principles.
Okay, Chris, lots to respond there from the claim that Trump is heedless of prudence and tradition, attacks on international institutions, but I'd like you to begin with Bret's constitutional points, because those are strong ones. He's saying on points ranging from endorsing a vision of birthright citizenship that liberal and conservative scholars both said was inconsistent with the original understanding of the Constitution, to ruling by executive orders in ways that thwart the kind of constitutional limitations that conservatives endorse, Trump and Republicans in Congress are betraying constitutional principles. Maybe start with that and then respond to the rest.
So I will. So the issue of birthright citizenship is something that is debated. That's number one. So there are people who have a different view of the 14th Amendment on that, which there is. I do think it's fair to say that the majority of constitutional scholars take Bret's point of view. There is a dissenting view out there. And it is perfectly legitimate for the president to pursue that view. It becomes a political question, not a judicial question. And I think that's where it is most appropriately decided, which is ask the question a different way. We believe in self-government. Self-government relies upon the citizens, and the citizens therefore have a right to decide who else becomes a citizen of the country and therefore has a share in that nation and that government. And when you think about it in those terms, I think the strongest argument is that this is not something that is most appropriately decided by judges, but is decided by the political branches. And I think that is where it should be decided, whether that be through legislation in Congress, or through an amendment. It's the only way that you settle the issue in a way that I think that is consistent with our basic principles, but also where you get a political settlement that people can live with.
Can I ask, just as the head of the Nonpartisan Constitution Center, because we had a podcast on this question, yeah. I can say just descriptively, the view that there's no birthright citizenship is very much a minority view, and people stood up in the Congress that proposed the 14th Amendment and said this will absolutely cover birthright citizenship. So how could an originalist conservative, who generally thinks the judges should be bound by the original understanding of the Constitution, believe that it should be settled politically?
Because remember, the Constitution is open to amendment, right? So citizens retain the right to change the Constitution. If you go back to those debates, which I know you probably know well, I mean, there is this other view which says that this pertains specifically to that place and time right after the Civil War, where you had freed slaves who were not previously covered as citizens and should be, and everybody agreed with that. Again, I believe that the question of who is a citizen and who is not is something that is fundamental to the nature of a self-governing republic, and the citizens have a right to have a say in that, as opposed to leaving it to the Supreme Court to decide based upon trying to interpret congressional records from 150 years ago.
You just heard Chris become a leftist. And I'll tell you why, because one of the great arguments on the left vis-a-vis, for example, the Second Amendment was, well, it was relevant for its time, when you could load a musket in about 1 or 2 minutes, but the Constitution this is the view of the left, the Constitution is a living document, and things that might have been true in 1789 or in 1868 ain't necessarily true today, and so we're going to move away from that interpretation and have a different interpretation, which is kind of what we say it is. So this is this is just one of the examples.
But I'm not saying it's an interpretation. I say that there needs to be an action either to amend the Constitution.
Okay,
right,
but
that's a different statement.
This was a plank of the Republican Party that said they don't have to recognize birthright citizenship without. We both agree that there is an amendment process that's uncontroverted, but that's not what the Republicans were trying to do. But there's another point here, and I think this is really important. One of the habits that Trump had, I'll never forget, a few days after the election, Bill O'Reilly, if you may remember who he was, he was an important journalist at his time, flawed character. He went and interviewed the president, and Bill, to his credit, said, Mr. President, some people say that you are in the habit of saying things that just aren't true. Like you keep saying that your crowd at the inauguration was bigger than Obama's crowd, and you keep saying that there were 3 million illegal votes that were cast that, had they not been cast, would have given you, a popular majority as well as the electoral college majority. And Trump's response was, well, some people say that 3 million illegal votes were cast. And that's what's known in terms of logic as an argumentum ad populum, which is like, well, people say Jim Morrison is like hanging out right over there, and with Kurt Cobain, as we speak, and Elvis. And so the fact that some people say it, that you can find a scholar or two who will say this, is not dispositive. It tells you actually absolutely nothing. And it goes to my deeper problem with Trump, which is the assault on truth. Like there is this fundamental problem that you have a president who, by some counts, I think they're exaggerated, but the Washington Post's last count is something like 10,800 and God knows how many.
That was just this morning, right?
Right. Well, this is really problematic because even more deeply than the question of being a conservative when it comes to, the Constitution or foreign policy, I remember one of the great debates when I was coming of age at the University of Chicago, and you're another Straussian character, was, conservatives believed that there was such a thing as the truth, and it wasn't relative, it wasn't culturally determined, it wasn't a function of who happened to be in power. The idea that there was no such thing as truth was actually a very Soviet idea. The Soviet idea of truth is what serves the party. The Trumpian idea of truth is whatever happens to be convenient to whatever it is I'm saying or whatever it is I need at some particular moment in time. It might not be true tomorrow or at my next interview. And I think this is kind of like an ontological assault, if I can get sort of heavy duty, on the way in which a liberal society can flourish. Because if you don't have those landmarks of saying, well, some things are true and not simply, well, some people say X and other people say Y, then you're in real trouble as a society.
Let's disaggregate. We can applaud and then remind ourselves, ontological assault and assault on the nature of knowledge. Tell us what a Straussian is, why you both are versions of Straussians, and why it's possible to be a Straussian and to support Donald Trump's assault on truth.
You're asking me what a Straussian is, and we have, only 40 minutes or something. Yeah.
You can do the
So,
short
so
version.
Leo Strauss was a political philosopher, a German emigre, an immigrant we love. He came to the United States after, you may know better what year he came to the United States, before the war, but is probably the greatest, in my view, political philosopher of the 20th century. Had a number of students, but basically he rediscovered, for a group of students, rediscovered classic texts in political philosophy and a way of understanding them that had been discarded for the past 200-ish years. There are different schools of Straussianism. There's an East Coast school and a West Coast school, and you will be shocked to know Bret finds himself in the East Coast school, and I find myself in the West Coast school, which basically comes from who Strauss's principal students were and then who you were educated by. Is that a fair enough short version?
And do all West Coast Straussians support Trump?
I don't think I can think of one that doesn't.
Is that right? And what in West Coast Straussianism leads ones to support Trump while East Coast Straussianism repudiate him?
So I certainly, I'll let Bret speak for the East Coast Straussians, but there is on the West Coast version of this is that while Trump has any number of character flaws, that his are probably not significantly different than other national politicians, though more in your face. And number two is that he's basically right on some important issues, like how do we deal with immigration, citizenship, rebuilding the middle class. How do we address national security vis-a-vis foreign policy? Do we continue to try nation-building wars, or do we return to sort of a pre-World War I idea of what American national security is, which is to say we operate best in promoting freedom by promoting our own freedom and security, and in John Quincy Adams' famous words, to act as a beacon. That was a historical Republican point of view. Changed in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War. But the West Coast Straussian view is that Trump, for whatever his other shortcomings may be, got those issues right, and that they are the main issues of our day. And then when you go into the voting booth, it's a binary choice. You pick one or the other.
Bret, we heard, some of us heard Governor Chris Christie on Monday night. He gave a version of this defense, minus the West Coast Straussian part. Not a perfect human being, flawed, not my first choice for president, but on policies I care about, and they weren't all the same policies because he disagreed about immigration. Basically correct, and therefore will support him. What do you think?
Number one, the other aspect about West Coast Straussianism that Chris didn't mention is they're always stoned.
You say that because we're in Colorado and...
Look, two points. The fundamental, this has become a very esoteric conversation when you thought we would be duking it out over, NATO or something. Leo Strauss basically said that thinkers like Aristotle and Plato and other ancient political philosophers who had important things to say about politics that were being ignored by the philosophers that emerge after Machiavelli, basically. And one of the things that those ancient philosophers were very attentive to was the question of virtue in politics, and the belief that you could not have a good politics without some degree of virtue, that freedom alone or kind of mechanisms alone, like the checks and balances of the Constitution, were not sufficient. There had to be a human element, and that human element had to be inflected with a concept of morality and duty, and that there was a difference between virtuous leaders and sophists and demagogues. And then by that token alone, Trump represents a triumph of demagoguery and should embarrass serious Straussians.
We'll come back to that.
So let me put it this way. I think for societies to be successful, they need to answer 4 questions correctly. Number one, what is their attitude towards immigrants? Do they see them as on net assets or liabilities? Number two, what is their attitude towards independent thinking and dissent? Do they believe that the gadfly is the benefit of society, or is he a heretic or whatever? Okay. Number three, what is their attitude towards failure? Do they believe in owning failure, or do they believe in blaming someone else for failure? And number four is, do they believe that one should define one's interests according to one's values, or one's values according to one's interests? And America, at its best, has always answered those questions right. We believe that immigration was an asset, not a liability, which is why more than 1/3 of American Nobel Prize winners were born abroad, why more than 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. We believe that independent thinking, that dissent, that a free press is essential to a successful society, and that efforts to quell it are ultimately ruinous. We believe that if we've made economic mistakes, the fault does not lie in sneaky Mexican trade practices, but with our own economy. And we believe, at our best, in a values-based leadership that understands that when we are, for instance, muscularly advancing concepts like human rights in places like Saudi Arabia as well as Iran, we are ultimately doing ourselves a great service, because we are showing that American leadership is not simply a matter of power, but a matter of example, and that it's capable of inspiring followers. And I think Trump answers all of these questions wrong.
So that's a powerful indictment. Let's move past our esoteric Straussianism and answer the claim that by embracing nativism, opposition to dissent, abandoning internationalism, and embracing tariffs, the Republican Party has not only sold its soul, according to Bret, but is betraying fundamental American values.
So, so those four answers, I think, are ahistorical. Let me start with immigration. So we had a massive wave of immigration, legal immigration, into this country between 1880 and 1924. In 1924, there was an Immigration Control Act passed, which held sway until 1964, and that gave there's to my way of thinking, that immigration wave, but in those 40 years between the 1880s and the middle of the 1920s, I think, did a lot of good things for this country. After 1924, or in 1924, the basically bipartisan perspective of the country was, we've had a lot of immigration. We need to now focus on some type of social stability and social cohesion. In other words, we had an enormous meal we have to digest. It wasn't a statement of principle that immigration is good or bad. It was a statement of prudence that says we've had a lot. There has got to be some logical limit to immigration, and so we're going to slow it down for now. What happened, which was something that was obviously not planned, is that there was a world war 20 years later, or less than 20 years later, and that going through that crucible of war really brought together the country in a way that I think was unintended and unpredictable, but beneficial, which said after the war, for instance, on my mother's side, Italian immigrants came in the early 20s and late teens, fully, fought in World War II. All these sorts of things, very fully embraced as part of a totally American society. And that's where I think we are again now. Since 1964, though really but more so since the late 80s, we've had another massive immigration wave. There is no mainstream view on the right that I'm aware of that says immigration is categorically good or categorically bad. It's a prudential question that says sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, and it's up to Congress to make these decisions, decide when, what's enough, what's too much. Do we slow it down? Do we speed it up? Is it a merit-based system? Does it take all comers, et cetera? And that's a place where I think that Trump and Republicans who support him and support, at this point, immigration restrictionism are I don't know if it's intentionally misunderstood or maybe it's unintentionally, but I can tell you I live and breathe in that world, and that is the view. Let me move to something like tariffs. The historic position of this country has been that tariffs work. This country, prior to the income tax, financed the federal government based on tariffs. Lincoln was pro-tariffs. Jefferson was pro-tariffs. Washington was pro-tariffs. Again, tariffs are a prudential question, not a question of principle. I don't think you judge the success or failure of your country based on whether or not the steel tariff is 6%, 0%, or 32.5% with a foreign country. That is an efficiency question. And so the Trump position, which I think strikes a sort of common sense note, which is, I believe in reciprocity. If country X wants to have 10% tariffs on steel, fine. We'll have 10% going both ways. If Canada wants to have 15% on lumber or dairy, fine, we will reciprocate. If they want to have 0, we'll do that too. And that to me is a common sense proposition, particularly when what we've seen is that the manufacturing base in this country has been destroyed. And the old argument, which is that, yeah, but we keep the high value jobs, over time what you find out is that the high value jobs, the design jobs, follow the manufacturing, and they follow them to Asia, first to China, and then to places like Vietnam and whatever. And as a result, we've seen what I alluded to before, which is we have seen the middle class shrink in size as a percentage of the population as a whole, and we've seen real incomes stagnate. And that's something that you want to talk about social stability or the ability to preserve self-government and constitutional government. If you have a shrinking middle class, you just can't do it. And that is what, I know that's one of that is the main thing that drives me, is you have to have that ballast of a stable, prosperous middle class if you want to be able to preserve constitutional self-government.
So, Bret, Chris's response is that on many of the policy questions you mentioned, from tariffs to immigration, the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party historically has been on both sides of these questions, and it's not a fundamental betrayal of American values. I want to ask you about judges. You supported the nominations of Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And George Will, who was here the other day, in his great new book, The Conservative Sensibility, basically says only judges can resurrect the Madisonian, Jeffersonian, classical liberal constitution that you endorse. George Will says that the post-New Deal regulatory state was a fundamental betrayal of the originalist constitution, and he enthusiastically calls on an original Supreme Court and on justices like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to resurrect the originalist constitution. Is it rational to support Trump because of judges?
Look, I'm delighted. Some of you may be horrified to learn I'm really pretty conservative, and I've actually been very pleased with the pick of judges, because I believe in kind of a constitutional originalism, which I only wish the president shared more fully in the execution of his duties. I also, and by the way, people describe me as a never Trump conservative. I'm not. I'm a sometimes Trump guy. Just to say, when he does things I agree with, I praise him, to the consternation of New York Times readers from time to time. And his judicial picks have been right. And the other thing, which I think is a very important aspect of understanding the Trump phenomenon, and why not Trump, but a figure like him in certain respects would have been salutary for politics, is that we have accreted an administrative state that is in many respects totally out of control. Now, one of the things that I'm conscious of, I'm a guy who writes for a living, and I live in Manhattan. I'm as coastal as it comes. But sometimes I feel like you can break down the American economy into two distinct sides. There's a words-based economy, and there's a stuff-based economy. I belong to the words-based economy. So do you, actually. So do you for the most part. Every lawyer does, every academic, every civil servant. What do? We shuffle around words. Like, I make my money by choosing between semicolons and periods. That's it. And I have the benefit of living in a totally unregulated economy thanks to something called the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, when I was talking to friends across the country in 2016, who would sort of sheepishly admit to me that in spite of it all, they were going to vote for Trump, they typically belong to the stuff-based economy. And I would sometimes listen to them and say, well, in fact, a friend of mine who runs a mid-sized company in San Diego, I said, do me a favor, write a memo and explain to me what it is to run a company with about 1,500 employees that's in the business of delivering certain kinds of goods across a wide swath of the West Coast. And he said, okay, I'm going to do it. He got his human resources team to work on this document, which was enormous and frightening, the extent to which the Department of Labor, OSHA, one thing or another, one well-intended regulation after another that was driving up his costs in ways that he simply couldn't afford because, unlike the Citibanks of the world, he can't simply just say, okay, we're going to hire 15,000 compliance officers tomorrow and solve our problem for us. His margins weren't that wide. And so in this sense, trying to roll back the administrative state, which is in a sense a legacy of FDR, is salutary. That being said, conservatism also recognizes that politics is not Robespierrean. You don't wave a magic wand. We have lived in a post-Roosevelt dispensation for 75 years. It's now become part of our sort of set of expectations about the individual's relationship with government. And I hope that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh understand what I think Kennedy got, which was that you have to respect the America as you find it, right? And I'll just say one thing about Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. I remember when Kennedy became a justice, and the New York Times wrote a fulminating editorial that Justice Kennedy was certain to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? Of course, he saved Roe v. Wade in Casey. Then Souter came along. He was certain to do it. So you have a history of conservative judges who, whether through education or a sense of prudence, have been, I think, much more restrained in their jurisprudence, and I suspect that'll be true of these two as well.
That's a crucial point. George Will came to the Constitution Center the other day, and I pressed him on this and said, conservatives, at least since the Warren era, have endorsed judicial restraint. They have criticized Democrats for appointing judges who would achieve through the judicial process what they can't achieve through the political process. Is it not a betrayal of that judicial restraint to now call for judicial engagement and to ask the Supreme Court to strike down the regulatory state? There was this fascinating opinion just last week, the Grundy case, where Justice Kagan said Justice Gorsuch's view, if endorsed by the majority of the court, would mean the end of government. Striking down the post-New Deal regulatory state would be so radical and so disruptive, it would not be conservative at all and would be the height of judicial activism. What is the response?
Bring on the activism. Government exists to execute a vision of the good and of justice. And if you believe in constitutionalism, as opposed to a blind belief in precedent, then the ratchet goes both ways, not just one way. And if you want to return to the text of the Constitution, then you return to the text, not to a precedent that you believe fundamentally betrayed the text. And that is, if that's called activism, then I think that is totally fine, and I have no problem embracing it in that regard.
One last round and then questions from the audience. Is Trump an existential threat to a principled Republican Party? And once he's gone, can the Republican Party restore its principles?
I mean, the term existential is a little shop-worn. I think we should reserve existential for things like hydrogen bombs,
I'll ask it again. Is it an existential threat to the American democracy, which some are claiming?
No, of course it's not. And listen, I detest the guy, okay? But let's keep a sense of proportion. Here you all are in pleasant old Aspen, and as far as I can see, the Stasi has not, or the Gestapo has not descended, right? There are things that, when I look at what's happening at the border, shame me as an American, I think are horrors, and those have to be, you have to speak out about it. But the moment you start reaching for like end of America type analogies or it's fascism, you're really losing the argument. But here's what I think Trump is potentially an existential threat to, which is a threat to the well-articulated conservatism that had emerged in the post-war period, which I think was fundamentally a responsible and intelligent version of conservatism. As I was listening to Chris earlier, I was thinking of a scene from an Al Pacino movie with Johnny Depp. And Al Pacino is like I can't remember the name of the movie, but he's like a second-tier mobster. And there's a scene in which, and Johnny Depp is an FBI informant who's like befriended Pacino. At any rate, there's a scene in which Pacino's son has a drug overdose, and Pacino and Depp are in the waiting room. The son's, being treated in the hospital. And Pacino, in that voice of his, he goes, "My son was born in this hospital. 28 years. No progress." And I was listening to your defense of tariffs, and I was thinking, okay, we're just resurrecting Hoover's view of the economy and the Smoot-Hawley,
Lincoln's.
No, we are bringing back. Lincoln is a different case because we have actually acquired a profound knowledge of economics thanks to data, thanks to social science. These things matter. You have, and I'm listening to a conservative. I went to the University of Chicago. We learn stuff about the benefits of free trading societies as opposed to autarchical societies. We learned that when China raises tariffs, it's hurting its own consumers while we are being enriched by them. Immigration is another story. I'm delighted Grandma Buskirk came in 1919 and not 1925, because otherwise I'd be alone on this stage and very lonely, right?
You may reconsider that later.
So every healthy democracy needs a morally sound conservative movement, because conservatism isn't just a philosophy, it's almost a psychological tendency. In any society you look at, there will always be a more conservative party. And it is important that the Conservative Party in the United States be a party that, at its best at least, represents a vision of openness and opportunity and engagement, as opposed to the normal conservative instinct of nativism and protectionism and frequently bigotry. And that's what I worry Trump is an existential threat to.
So last word on this point, and then audience questions. Bret has said Trump is not a existential threat to American democracy, not an existential threat to the Republican Party, but is an existential threat to a principled, well-articulated conservatism. Response?
Yeah, no, I view Trump as actually an opportunity to return to some first principles. I think that when I think about, and I was actually just having this conversation 2 days ago with somebody who said, why Trump's sort of disappointing me. This is somebody who's a Trump supporter and a smart person, business person, not unlike the person in San Diego you described. And I said, yes, but Donald Trump knew how to get elected, but he doesn't understand how to operate the levers of power, right? Had Hillary Clinton won and she had an agenda, the people she was going to bring in knew exactly how to execute immediately. Barack Obama, same thing. Donald Trump went in with a very thin team, mostly who were inexperienced or didn't really understand how to execute the agenda to the extent that it was more than a statement of sort of slogans or principles. And so my answer was, don't expect the solutions that you were, the end solutions that you were hoping for. This is an opportunity to change the conversation back to things that were important before Reagan. Right, warmed over Reaganism, I think, is irrelevant today. The idea that the Republican Party can simply run on tax cuts and trade with China, it's an electoral loser, but the things that we think we learned about economics turned out not to be true, which is why, again, I'm going to keep coming back to this. I'm going to beat the drum. The middle class is smaller and poorer, and that is, and if that is the result of what we've learned about economics, we need to learn something else, because that is the heart and soul of the country, and we need to figure out how to rebuild that element. Otherwise, all the other political things we talk about just don't come into play again. They just become irrelevant.
10 minutes for audience questions. Yes, ma'am, in the white shirt. Yes.
Can you hear me?
I have a mic.
Oh, hi. Oops, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. First of all, Bret, you're a great vocabulary teacher. My question is, I keep hearing, whether it was Chris Christie or Chris, what you were saying, many Trump supporters saying yes, but. And I'm curious what you feel about a movement to bring in another viable Republican to run against Trump who might be better than yes, but.
Is that to me or to Bret?
to both of you. I mean, it's a,
there-
you know,
there-
if the, like, just, where is there room for the Republican Party to bring in somebody that spans what you both feel and serves, and, yeah.
I'll just answer it this way. I'll say it's not where, it's when. It's 2024. There's zero appetite among Republican voters to replace the president in 2020. And in any event, what we found out in 2016 is he ran against 16 other very impressive candidates and beat all of them. And so who's the white knight? Even if you wanted one, as I say, I don't think there's an appetite for one. But if there were that appetite, who would be that person? Because they ran 3 years ago. And so it's a when question. This goes to the point I'm talking about, an opportunity. I got drawn back into politics after 20 years in business because I thought that we were in a unique political moment. And I've talked to candidates who I know are running in 2020 who are doing the same thing. Some have come out of the military, some have come out of business because they think that this is a unique political moment, that that they can talk about issues in a way that would have been verboten for Republicans to talk about. Again, tariffs. And could you imagine 5 years ago, Republicans saying we can't run on tax cuts, like I did a few minutes ago? You'd be drummed out of the party. And yet that is not a totally heterodox opinion. Even though I like lower taxes, it's insufficient. And so it's a time, really, I see this as a time to rebuild the party and the candidates and to get beyond just trying to run on the 1980 platform over and over again.
More questions? Yes. Perfect. I can't see too well, but that's perfect.
I have to start this question with an opinionated assertion.
Not too long.
I do believe that the Democrats are more condensed in their thinking and more conservative, and the Republicans are more spread out in their thinking. And the middle line is what I believe to be conservative is mostly Democrat. And so the election the last year was the Democrats mostly forced the hand because the conservative Democrats ultimately voted for Trump. And so I want to have your opinion of where Democrat conservatives fall in future elections.
Great question. And Bret, you could broaden it a bit to gaming out the Democratic field, what's going to happen, and as a conservative, are there any of them that you could support?
But unfortunately, the Democratic Party seems to be hell-bent on marginalizing, shaming, or insulting the moderate heart of the party. And I think this is one of the reasons why Trump is likely to win re-election. I thought it was, stunning to see I thought totally preposterous attack on Joe Biden because he mentioned in passing that, he was able to get along as a young senator with a couple of Southern Democrats who had a history as segregationists. And this was, almost too much for today's Democratic Party. The Democrats seem to be, remind me, there's a famous quip about Adlai Stevenson when he was running in 52 or 56. Some woman came up to him and said, Governor Stevenson, every intelligent American is behind you. And he said, Madam, thank you, but what I require is a majority. And the Democratic Party is drumming out too much of its conservative base. There are plenty of Democrats, for instance, who may be pro-choice but with limitations. But that's becoming a very difficult view to hold in the Democratic Party today. There are a lot of Democrats who aren't on board with, for example, reparations as a particularly good idea. That also is becoming problematic. They don't necessarily like the idea of a Democratic Party going and destroying what have, at least so far, for all their problems, been champions of American industry, especially in Silicon Valley, by turning them into into utilities. So I think the Democratic Party needs to really think carefully about whether it is simply isolating itself so it can enjoy its own company and think of itself as the society of the virtuous, or it's actually trying to build bridges to those millions of Americans who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 and then voted for Donald Trump in 2016.
If Biden got the nomination, would you vote for him?
Yes.
Last question. Yes, sir.
By the way, I can't believe I'm saying that, right? I mean, in other circumstances, I was very straight-laced. I never did drugs, okay? But honestly, every day of the Trump administration seems to me what like an LSD trip must be like, because you're like, oh my God, right?
Welcome to Aspen. Last, sir, in the front row. Last question.
Chris, I heard you say something, I don't want to misrepresent it, about, most politicians are like Trump, they just kind of keep it under wraps, or something to that effect. I'd like to, if it's okay, hear both of you. Chris, I'd love to expand on that a little bit, and I'd like to hear Bret's take on it as well.
So I didn't say quite that, but you're close, and my basic point is twofold. One is that Trump is a known adulterer. This is something that people come back to a lot. He's on his third wife, and there's all these scandalous stories. I'm assuming a number of them are true. As my wife likes to say, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. He did. Okay. So the question then is what is this the first president who has been an adulterer? Hardly, right? I mean, we have had presidents alleged, but there are credible allegations against JFK of rape too. Bill Clinton, right? So my point is this, and this goes back to my earlier point about how conservatives view humanity flawed, deeply flawed. And so, I come to this and I look at any candidate and say, I understand that they are probably deeply flawed people. And I don't exclude myself from that, by the way. But I want to make a distinction between public virtue and private vice. And there is obviously, that is a formula where you have to make, mileage may vary on how that works, where there is some amount of private vice that's too much for you. But you have to also weigh in the balance public virtue. Is what this candidate's going to do for the country good enough to say, well, yeah, he's on his third wife. I don't believe in adultery. I don't do it, but he's not the first. And if I was only willing to vote for people who never were adulterers, I would not have very many people to vote for.
Bret, let me phrase the question as, is it okay for conservatives to separate public virtue from private vice?
So, there's a great difference between Kennedy, who was, a notorious and aggressive philanderer, as was LBJ and, many other people, with Trump, because their vices were, through kind of collusion between the White House and the media, were kept off stage. Trump is the first president who has modeled shamelessness as a kind of a virtue, as he sees it. And which is to say, like, he's not, you're like, oh, Mr. President, you lied. You said X yesterday and this today. And he's like, whatever. Now, I think that's profoundly problematic, and it should be especially problematic to conservatives, because we understand that an essential aspect of leadership is role modeling. And so he's role modeling a style of shameless leadership that is going to come back to haunt us. I mean, I started work at the Wall Street Journal back in the days of the Clinton impeachment saga, and oh boy, did we hear it from Bill Bennett and other current Trump supporters. Remember that book, The Death of Outrage? Well, actually that was a point. Bill Clinton, in some ways, pioneered a style of shamelessness which is now coming back to haunt Democrats, because Trump can only say, well, Bill did it, and so I can do it. But conservatives, be warned. 10 years from now, it's going to be a Democratic president who is every bit as mendacious, every bit as shameless, every bit as embarrassing to us as parents and as embarrassing to us as Americans every time he opens his mouth. And when we try to say something about it, our Democratic friends will say, you know, we remember your sophistry about public virtue and private virtue, and we've adopted your view now. It just happens to be our turn to be, you know, shameless on our side and get our wishes politically. And at that point, we won't have a leg to stand on, and we will have instructed our children in the belief that politics is a filthy game conducted by despicable individuals, right? It's a blood sport where there is no higher concept of honor and public service. I grew up in Mexico. I grew up outside of the United States. Let me tell you something. It makes a great deal of difference when you can look at presidential leaders or political leaders and say, I actually admire that person. And as opposed as I was to Barack Obama on policy grounds, I was never embarrassed as an American that he was my president for the 8 years of his tenure.
Ladies and gentlemen, for modeling a civil debate about the diversity of views in the conservative movement, please join me in thanking our panelists.